In Ursula K. Leguin's fourth Earthsea novel, Tehanu, one of the key themes that runs throughout the entire work is that of teaching and learning. Tenar has to determine what kind of things young Therru, the maimed and abused child, ought to be taught, what things she ought to learn, and who should be doing the teaching and how. And it's not just the challenge that faces every parent, what to do with their children, how to prepare them for life. In this case, Tenar has been given a charge by her old teacher and, in effect, parent, Ogion, the mage. And as he is on his way towards death, he tells her about Therru, that she has to do something. And he sends everybody away. When little Therru woke, he spoke to her in the kind, dry, quiet way Tenar remembered. The child went out to play in the sun, and he said to Tenar, "What is the name you call her?" He knew the true language of the making, but he'd never learned any Kargish at all. "Therru means burning, the flaming of fire," she said. Ah, he said, and his eyes gleamed and he frowned. He seemed to grope for words for a moment, and now he says two really important things. "That one," he said, "that one, they will fear her." "They fear her now," Tenar said bitterly. The mage shook his head. So he's giving a kind of, prognostication or prophecy about the fear that people are going to feel in relation to Therru. That is not the fear simply of a maimed, burned child, that perhaps it's, not just evil has been done to it, but it is evil. Rather, it's about what's going to happen when Therru does, in fact, come into her power, although Tenar doesn't get that at that point in time. Then he says, "Teach her, Tenar, teach her all. Not Roke, they are afraid. Why did I let you go? Why did you go to bring her here too late?" Meaning that Ogion himself would have taken part in teaching young Therru. And he's saying, not Roke. What does that actually mean? Well, Roke is this island where the high arts are being taught. We'll get an interpretation of that a little bit later from Beach, which let's take a look at that right now, because it's a what we could call a rather facile interpretation. It's not one that we ought to have any credence in. So Tenar says, "Ogion told me to teach her all," he said, and then not Roke. I don't know what he meant. Beach had no difficulty with it. He meant that the learning of Roke, the high arts, wouldn't be suitable for a girl, let alone one so handicapped. But if he said to teach her all but that lore, it would seem that he, too, saw her way might well be the witch's way. He pondered again more cheerfully, having gotten the weight of Ogion's opinion on his side. "In a year or two, when she's quite strong and grown a bit more, you might think about asking Ivy to begin teaching her a bit. Not too much, of course, even that kind of thing, till she still has her true name." And Tenar feels a strong, immediate resistance to the suggestion. She says nothing because Beach is a sensitive man. So this is probably not the right interpretation we're getting, right? But what is the right interpretation? It's going to be much more simple and much more complex than that. So we've got these two things. They will fear her, teach her all, don't teach her Roke, or don't teach her at Roke. And then we have a number of different occasions where teaching comes up. One of the first ones has to do with the witch, Auntie Moss. And we find that, here we go, Moss got on with the burned child. Perhaps it was Moss who was working this change, this slight easing in Therru with her. Therru behaved as with everyone else, blank, unanswering, docile in the way an inanimate thing, a stone, is docile. But the old woman had kept at her, offering her little sweets and treasures, bribing, coaxing, wheedling. "Come with Auntie Moss now, dearie. Come along, and Auntie Moss will show you the prettiest sight you ever saw." And she says she took the child into the fields and showed her a lark's nest in the green hay, or into the marshes to gather white hallows, wild mint, and blueberries. She did not have to shut the child in an oven or change her into a monster or seal her in stone. That had been done already. Those were the things witches were supposed to do. She was kind to Therru, but it was a wheedling kindness, and when they were together, it seemed she talked to the child a great deal. Tenar did not know what Moss was telling or teaching her, whether she should let the witch fill the child's head with stuff. And as they go on in the thing, watching Moss with Therru now, she thought Moss was following her heart, but it was a wild, dark, queer heart like a crow going its own ways on its own errands. And she thought Moss might be drawn to Therru not only by kindness, but by Therru's hurt, by the harm that had been done to her by violence, by fire. So she's thinking there's something not quite right about this, or something that needs to be watched. But then she says, nothing Therru did or said showed she was learning anything from Auntie Moss except where the lark nested and the blueberries grew and how to make cats' cradles one-handed. And Tenar thought, what bond linked her herself to the child beyond pity, mere duty to the helpless? It's okay for Moss to teach her, in part because Therru is just learning bits and pieces of things. She's not learning a way of life. She's not learning Moss's perspective so much. A little bit later, there's some ideas about maybe apprenticing Therru. We'll talk about the witch one in just a moment. But first, there's an idea about perhaps apprenticing her to Fan the Weaver. And Tenar is thinking to herself. Tenar thought of Therru sitting at that loom, it would be a decent living. The bulk of the work was dull, always the same over, but weaving was an honorable trade, and in some hands a noble art. And people expected weavers to be a bit shy, often to be unmarried, shut away at their work as they were, yet they were respected. And working indoors at a loom, Therru would not have to show her face, but the claw hand, could that hand throw the shuttle, warp the loom? And was she to hide all her life? But what was she to do, knowing what her life must be? So on the way, Tenar is thinking about these things. And then when she finds Therru missing, she thinks to herself, this is my penalty for having these thoughts. She said, this was her fault, that she had caused it to happen by thinking of making Therru into a weaver, shutting her away in the dark to work to be respectable. When Ogion had said, teach her all, Tenar. And here's a very important line. When she knew that a wrong that cannot be repaired must be transcended. When she knew that the child had been given her and she'd failed in her charge, failed her trust, lost the one great gift. Therru is special. Tenar is supposed to teach her. It's not just her gut instinct telling her this, but her own teacher who says you need to teach her all. Not just find an occupation, a vocation for her that's going to be safe and, in some respects, the easy way out. You need to embrace this difficulty. Then there's Ivy the Witch. And after this conversation with Beach, she goes to Ivy and she says, listen, I would like to talk to you about apprenticing Therru for a witch when she's a bit older. And Ivy says, well, I wouldn't take her. And there's already some bad blood, some background between Tenar and Ivy. Ivy, like most of the women, in the vicinity, thinks that Tenar has been a bit too uppity, has played off of her difference, being a former priestess, being the mage of Ogion. And Tenar thinks, yeah, actually there's something to that. I'd better start, mending bridges with Ivy. And so she talks with Ivy and she says, well, why not? What do you have against Therru? And she says, she's a child, an ill-used child. And Tenar gets angry and says, that's not all she is. Must a prentice witch be a virgin? And Ivy says, that's not what I mean. So here we get a really interesting discussion that bears on who Therru is, but also bears on what kind of education she should receive. Ivy says this, I don't know what she is. When she looks at me with that one eye seeing and one eye blind, I don't know what she sees. I see you go about with her like she was any child, and I think, what are they? What is the strength of that woman? For she's not a fool to hold a fire by the hand, to spin thread with a whirlwind. They say, mistress, that you lived as a child yourself with the old ones, the dark ones, the ones underfoot, and that you were queen and servant to those powers. Maybe that's why you're not afraid of this one. What power she is, I don't know. But it's beyond my teaching. I know that, or beaches, or any witch or wizard I ever knew. I give you my advice, beware her the day she finds her strength, that's all. And Tenar is still angry. She says nobody would help her, she thought. She knew the job was beyond her. They didn't have to tell her that, but none of them would help her. Ogion had died, and old moss ranted, and ivy warned, and beach kept clear, and Ged, the one who might really have helped Ged, ran away. So, she's feeling overwhelmed by and perplexed by this charge of teaching Therru. And there's a point where she considers to herself what she's actually imparting to Therru. There's a very important passage where this takes place, and she thinks, am I just giving her training in domestic things? Here we go. Therru plays with these, what she calls the bone people, I should be teaching her, Tenar thought, distressed. Teach her all, Ogion said. And what am I teaching her? Cooking and spinning? Then another part of her mind said in Goha's voice, Goha is her use name, are those not true arts, needful and noble? Is wisdom all words? So, the domestic thing, this is actually a very important theme. And Ged will actually clean up his own plate and do things that Tenar's kind of spoiled son, Spark, won't do because that's women's work, right? One of the messages in this is that so-called women's work isn't really women's work, it's needful work. And cooking is an art, and spinning is an art. All you got to do, if you don't know about these sorts of things, is try your hand at them for an hour and then a day and find out just how much art is involved in cleaning, for example. But is that what she should be teaching Therru? Those are useful things, but that's not where it should end, right? A domestic education. So she starts talking to her. She says, maybe it's time you began to learn the true names of things. There's a language in which all things bear their true names, and deed and word are one. By speaking that tongue, Sugoi raised up the islands from the deep. It's the language the dragons speak. The child listened silent. Tenar laid down her carding combs and picked up a small stone from the ground. In that tongue, this is Tolk, the stone, right? One that was used as an example in Wizard of Earthsea, by the way. That's the only word that Tenar actually teaches her in the old tongue, and she talks about that with Ged later on. She told him how she had taught Therru the one word and then had stopped, for it had not seemed right, though she did not know why. Now, this is very interesting, right? Why? Why shouldn't she go on and teach her more? I thought perhaps it was because I'd never truly spoken that language, never used it in majory. I thought perhaps she should learn it from a true speaker of it. Ged says, well, no human being is a true speaker of that. And he says, only the dragons speak it as their native tongue. And then Tenar says, do they learn it? And he was slow to answer, calling to mind all he'd been told and knew of the dragons. I don't know. What do we know about them? Would they teach as we do, mother to child, elder to younger? Or are they like animals, teaching some things but born knowing most of what they know? Even that we don't know, but my guess would be the dragon and the speech of the dragon are one being. They don't learn, they are. So, this seems to be a bit of a digression. Of course, it's going to turn out that perhaps Therru doesn't need to be taught the old speech. So what is she taught instead? Tenar says, here's what I can do for you. Maybe when you have your true name, I'll teach you the words. Not now. Now listen, now is the time for stories, for you to begin to learn the stories. I can tell you stories of the archipelago and the Kargish lands. I told you a story I learned from my friend Ihal the Silent. Now I'll tell you one I learned from my friend Lark when she told it to her children in mine. This is the story of Andar and Avad. As long as forever, as far away as Celador, there lived a man called Andar, and it sort of tapers off here. So she's teaching her the lore of the land that she lives in, which is still something quite useful, right? And later on, we're going to find that Therru is learning some of the great songs and can recite them to Ged. She's learning them very quickly as well. She's a bright kid. And so until the radical revelation that happens in the last chapter of the work, this is the course of Therru's education. As it's going to turn out, perhaps some of it is in fact not needful or redundant, but all of it is an attempt for Tenar to fulfill what Ogion is telling her she needs to do and to do right by the child.